Welcome back. We're going to be looking today at some broad social issues that had a major impact on the country from 1800 until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, and the impact of these social issues continued well after the Civil War. Thus far, we've focused on the American interest in having political rights, independence, and then extending the suffrage to all white men by the late 1820s, which of course led to the election of Andrew Jackson as president. Now Americans are becoming increasingly interested in religious salvation for themselves and others. As they put it at the time, the path to heaven was becoming more, quote, democratic, in the sense that everyone could save themselves. And this was a Christian movement. This was a Protestant movement. Catholics were not particularly involved in this evangelical movement that we'll be discussing today. As we've seen before when we discussed the concept of manifest destiny, there was a widespread belief at the time that America was exceptional and America was on a mission directed by God. America was morally better than Europe, was the widespread belief, and Americans needed to expand across the continent to spread what they viewed as their blessings of civilization. At the same time, along with the religious impulse, there was a strong belief that people as well as society could be made more perfect by reform. This is tied in with the Enlightenment concept of progress that we saw before when we talked about the Enlightenment. So today we'll be looking at the Second Great Awakening on the religious side, and then we'll also be looking at some of the reform movements. First, turning to the Second Great Awakening, you recall in the previous century, there was the Great Awakening, which in retrospect became the first because there was a second. Now the textbook goes into some detail on the different Protestant denominations, but you should read that, understand it, it's useful context, but don't worry, for the purposes of the examination, I will only focus on what I discuss in the lecture, so please again use the PowerPoint slides as your study guides. As I just mentioned, this Second Great Awakening, like the first, was Protestant. It did not involve the Catholics, who of course are Christians, but not Protestant, nor did it involve those of the Jewish faith. The focus is now on the individual, reforming the individual and spiritual savior of the individual. The Second Great Awakening led directly to a proliferation of Christian denominations because many groups split into new denominations, either over theological issues or over the issue of slavery. There was a widespread belief that without religion as a guide for moral and ethical behavior, the United States would fall into basically chaos with unbridled or unrestricted appetites and lust. And because of the increased materialism, people were very concerned the increasing standard of living, and people were very concerned that material goods would become the end-all for so many people. The overall message of the Second Great Awakening was that salvation is available to anyone, regardless of their social standing, who repents for their sins and embraces Jesus Christ. So in this sense, the Second Great Awakening was viewed by people at the time as very democratic. There was a great increase in the number of formal members of churches. In 1760, just before the United States became independent, only 1 in 6 Americans belonged to a church. I say only 1 in 6 because I think there's a widespread belief that at that time everybody was a member of church. While virtually everybody believed that they were Christian, very few actually participated in their religion. However, by 1850, about 100 years later, 1 in 3 Americans were a formal member of a church and actively attended religious services. Now, the Methodists were particularly involved in opposing slavery. In the North, the Methodists actively recruited the free blacks in the North to join the church. This obviously was not well received by the many Methodists in the southern part of the United States and led to a division among the Methodists into the Southern Methodists and the Methodists in the North. Here we have a slide of a revival meeting. We saw similar meetings when we saw the First Great Awakening in the 1700s. Again, this is before the day and age of electronic amplification. So a speaker had to not only speak well, but had to have a loud voice so thousands could hear him or her. And here you just see people almost fainting at the words of these revival ministers. Another drawing at the time, again similar to what we saw in the last century in the First Great Awakening. And these revival services were held out in the countryside. They were not generally held in large cities, and people would travel from their farms, from small towns, and you can see in the background the temporary tents that were sent up for shelter, and they'd usually spend 5 or 6 days there. One of the uniquely American Christian denominations or Protestant denominations to develop during this general time period were the Mormons. The Mormons, also formerly known as the Church of Latter-day Saints. And I heard recently that the Mormon church based in Salt Lake City, Utah, has now said that they no longer want to be referred to as Mormons, but rather the Church of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith was the founder. There's some more detail in the textbook which you should read. He believed that God, the angels, and humans were all sort of the same human species. He lived in northern New York. He claimed that he found some golden tablets and that this was the revealed work of God. And then he and his followers steadily moved west because they were persecuted for their religious beliefs. They moved from New York, and in the next slide we'll show you their trajectory. They moved to Missouri, and there Smith was killed by a mob who accused him of being a traitor. And one thing that particularly angered the other Americans at the time was the Mormon belief in polygamy. This is where a man could have more than one wife. And eventually they moved for refuge to Salt Lake City, Utah, for religious freedom. Actually, at the time they arrived in Utah, Utah was still part of Mexico. And shortly after they arrived, there was the U.S. war with Mexico. And so the Mormons found themselves no longer in Mexico, where the Mexicans hardly knew they were there, because Salt Lake City, Utah was on the extreme fringes of the Mexican Republic. But all of a sudden they found themselves in the United States. As the population increased in Salt Lake City and in Utah, the territory, over time, the territory applied for statehood, but Congress in the 1890s refused to allow Utah to enter as long as there was polygamy in the state. And so at that time, the Mormon Church formally ended polygamy. So well over 100 years ago, the practice of polygamy ended. Here you can see what I mentioned before, the sort of trek of the Mormons from 1830 to 1851. And you can see they arrived in Utah just before it was taken over by the United States at the end of the war with Mexico. And they planned the whole area you can see here in purple was what they planned to set up as their territory. So they traveled extensively in that territory. Here we see a slide from the 1880s, early 1890s, I'm not sure exactly when, of a Mormon family on the move. And you can see the man in the foreground and several wives in the background. Many have pointed out it's ironic that the Mormons founded what is now Las Vegas, Nevada, which is known as Sin City in the U.S., because the Mormons themselves did not, nor do they today, use alcoholic liquor. They don't smoke tobacco, nor do they use caffeine, because that violates the human body, which is the house of God. And they founded Las Vegas, obviously not as Sin City, but they founded it as a small city because there was natural spring water there. And as the Mormons traveled through that dry area of the Southwest, they set up a small settlement today. The Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, has grown significantly since its foundation. And today it's the fourth largest religion in the world after Christianity, the Muslim religion, and Judaism, or the Jewish religion. Now I'd like to leave the Second Great Awakening and turn to the great movement for social and moral reforms in the 19th century. Crucial to this reform movement was the widespread increase in the number of newspapers being printed as well as read. The printing technology improved significantly. No longer did you have a man printing a newspaper page by page by pulling down on a printing press, but rather you have steam-driven rotary drums that could produce many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of newspaper per hour. The price of newspapers, as a result, plummeted. They became very inexpensive and widely available. In fact, they were called penny dailies because you could buy a daily newspaper for a penny. This led to a great increase in public debate on politics as well as moral issues. And indeed, by 1850, the United States had the most newspapers in the world and the widest circulation in the world. This was not so true in the South because many of the whites still could not read. And of course, the black slaves were not taught to read. But in the North and the Midwest, and now in the West, which is becoming popular, you had an incredible number of newspapers. This slide we see in Baltimore. This is in a museum in Baltimore. This was a restaurant or cafe in Baltimore, depicting two men discussing an article in the newspaper. And for those who didn't want to buy a newspaper, they could go to any coffee house or restaurant, and there was a newspaper to read while they waited. Now, the reform movement was led now largely by the middle class. The so-called working class was not driving this movement, and part of it was, of course, they were so busy working, taking care of their families, they didn't have the time to devote themselves to reform. The main issue for moral reform was limiting the use of alcohol. This started first as the temperance movement. Temperance does not mean prohibition on the consumption of alcohol, but rather for people to temper or moderate their consumption, just drink a little less. And alcohol became seen as the main cause, the root cause of most social problems. In fact, it was a great problem with many, many men publicly drunk in the streets, attacking people, attacking women walking down the streets, attacking men walking down the streets, and obviously not being able to work because they were alcoholics. The movement to try and encourage men, because the problem was among men, to drink slightly less or somewhat less was a total failure. So the movement quickly moved from moderation to complete abstinence. Now, this drove many moderates from the movement, many moderates who enjoyed an alcoholic beverage themselves, but the movement again became total abstinence, or what became in the 1920s prohibition. Another focus of the reform movement also was trying to improve the living conditions in both prisons and mental asylums. Now, for the first time, we have an attempt to move people who the doctors believe are mentally disturbed, separate those from the common prisoners. There's also a movement now for women's rights, and this focused on the women's right to vote. And of course, women finally achieved that right on the national level in 1919 with an amendment to the Constitution. But before 1919, a number of states in the West did give the right to vote to women. And there was great progress in other areas for women. By 1860, 12 of the states gave married women control over their property. This would be property that women would acquire either as an inheritance if their father died, or money or property that they would acquire virtue of their marriage. If their husband passed away, they could then inherit the money. More women were becoming better educated in a sense. Very few were still not going to universities. And these women suffered discrimination in that their professional careers were almost exclusively limited to nursing, which was felt to be a proper career for women, as well as teaching, and not teaching in institutions of higher education, in other words, universities, but teaching elementary schools. There was a great push that started immediately after the revolution to set up more public schools with the belief that that would lead to informed voters. And indeed, by 1850, just before the Civil War, half of the white children of school age were in schools. And this is by far the highest percent in the world, much higher than in Western Europe at the time. Most high schools remained private, so most white children only went to elementary school and the first years of what we now consider junior high school. So only the upper classes could afford the private schools for high school. Here we see a photograph. This was taken actually after the Civil War, slightly after the Civil War. And you can see classes were segregated by gender. The women with a male teacher in this instance. In addition to the abolitionist movement in the North, you also had an anti-slavery movement, and this was designed to deal with free blacks. Now, and many in the South, many slaveholders in the South were concerned about the presence of free blacks because it muddied the waters for them, because they'd rather see all the blacks in slavery. So the American Colonization Society was set up, and the idea was to send the free blacks back to their African homeland. And this was supported by Andrew Jackson, whom you recall was a major slaveholder himself, John Marshall, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, James Madison, and others. And so these wealthy people bought some land in West Africa, and actually they received 15,000 volunteers. They didn't force people to go back, but they offered people free passage back to Africa, as well as some money to start a farm and whatnot. And so 15,000 free blacks went to South Africa under this scheme. And this was the new country of Liberia, which still exists. As I mentioned, Liberia still exists, and Liberia, having been established by these Americans, was set up very much on the model of the United States. Its constitution is very similar to that of the United States, as well as the flag, which you can see on the next slide. So this is the flag of the country of Liberia. At the same time, in terms of reform with slavery, you had the famous newspaper editor William Lloyd Garrison in Boston move from his initial position of moderation, saying there should be a gradual abolition of slavery over decades and decades. And then he favored immediate abolition of slavery. Well, obviously, this was not well received in the South, nor was it well received by many whites in the North. And Mr. Garrison actually was beaten by a group of whites in Boston because they felt that he'd gone too far in favoring abolition of slavery. Frederick Douglass was by far the best known black man in the United States during this period. He was an escaped slave. He'd been a slave in the state of Maryland, which was a border state. It was fairly easy for him to escape to a free state because it wasn't very far. He traveled throughout the North giving speeches about his experience of being a slave on the need to abolish slavery. He wrote a book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which is sort of about his life story. This was very, very widely read, and I assume most of you read this book in either junior high school or high school in courses either on U.S. history or English. Another well-known black speaker at the time was Sojourner Truth. She was a slave woman who had been freed and had moved up north. She traveled throughout the North giving speeches. Sojourner Truth was not her actual name. She gave herself that name, and she said that God had instructed her to travel, and the word sojourn, which we don't use much anymore, but the word sojourn means traveler, and that God had instructed her to travel and speak the truth about slavery. So her name was Sojourner Truth. In using today's vocabulary, you probably want to call her truth traveler or something like that. But she, filled up the auditoriums wherever she went and spoke. And having served as an actual slave, or not served as been a slave, she could talk about the horrors of slavery firsthand. And this, of course, infuriated the Southerners, that former slaves such as Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth were traveling throughout the North, and the Southerners claimed that they were lying or exaggerating. But for the Northerners, they were appalled to hear confirmation firsthand from the lips of former slaves of how evil the institution had been. Now, the Underground Railroad was set up, an informal system which was quite efficient to assist runaway slaves from moving through the South and up to the North. Obviously, it's not a railroad in the physical sense of a train track and railroad cars. It was called a railroad because it moved like a railroad. You had people in each farm or little village who would help the slaves who were trying to escape, and they were called conductors. Here we see a map of the main routes of the Underground Railroad. You can see some people actually some slaves went to Mexico, very few, because when Texas joined the United States, um, it had slavery. Um, this map is when Texas was an independent country. It also had slavery then. Some tried to escape through Florida to the Caribbean. That was difficult because there was extensive slavery in the Caribbean. Um, and it was obviously very dangerous for the white people or free blacks who were um, the so-called conductors on the Underground Railroad to help the blacks escape. Now, by 1850, about 10 years before the Civil War broke out, many Americans in the North, Midwest, and West believed slavery was evil. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. It was evil. And the real question is, should it be allowed to expand into the Western territories? This belief continued. We'll see now over the next 10 years a series of events that hardened the positions both in the North and the South, and of course reached its climax in the Civil War. Thank you very much.